Imagine the suffocating heat of boiling oil churning inside a bronze cauldron, thick steam rising in dense columns above the Roman arena, the acrid smell of scorching fat burning the nostrils of the assembled crowd. Now imagine all of that failing completely to kill the 90-year-old man thrown into it. This is the story of how the Apostle John walked out alive from a cauldron of boiling oil in the very heart of Rome. Place yourself in the year 95 of the Christian era. Emperor Domitian has ruled Rome with an iron fist for 14 years. The Colosseum has been hosting bloody spectacles for 15. And Christianity, which began as an obscure Jewish sect in Galilee, now has communities scattered across the entire Mediterranean, from Syria to Hispania. For Domitian, this represents an unacceptable political threat. Christians refuse to offer incense before the emperor's image, and that refusal is interpreted as direct treason against the Roman state. Understand the scale of the emperor's problem. Rome demanded imperial cult worship in every province. Every citizen was required to acknowledge the emperor as divine, reciting a ritual formula in Latin that meant Caesar is Lord. Christians answered with a single phrase that sealed their fate: only Jesus is Lord. And in that context, that phrase was a death sentence. Consider the central figure of this story, John, son of Zebedee, brother of James, a former fisherman from Galilee, now approximately 90 years old. He is the last living apostle. Peter was crucified upside down in Rome under Nero in the year 64. Paul was beheaded around the same time. James, John's brother, was killed by the sword under Herod Agrippa in the year 44. As recorded in Acts chapter 12. Stephen was stoned in the earliest years of the church. Thomas was killed in India. Bartholomew was skinned alive in Armenia. Andrew was crucified in an X-shape in Greece. Philip, Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas, Thaddeus, all dead for their faith. John is the only one left. Consider the weight of that fact. An old man, frail, living in Ephesus in the Roman province of Asia, leading a growing Christian community. He had known Jesus personally. He had reclined against his chest at the Last Supper, as recorded in the Gospel that bears his name, chapter 13, verse 23. He had stood at the foot of the cross when Jesus entrusted him with the care of Mary, his mother, according to John 19, verses 26 and 27. He had run with Peter to the empty tomb on Sunday morning, and now, 62 years after those events, he was the sole living link between the original apostolic generation and the expanding church. Domitian knew this, and he intended to finish the work. Follow the arrest process. The records of Tertullian, written around the year 200 of the Christian era, in the work known as On the Prescription of Heretics, chapter 36, indicate that John was brought to Rome for trial. This was not a quick death in Ephesus. The emperor wanted spectacle. He wanted to make the last apostle a public example before the entire empire. The journey from Ephesus to Rome covered approximately 2,500 kilometers. Roman soldiers escorted the old apostle by sea, skirting the Greek coast, passing through the ports of Macedonia, crossing the Adriatic until landing at the harbors of Italy. Consider that crossing, a man of 90 years in chains, sleeping on damp timber, subsisting on hardened ship's biscuit, exposed to salt and sun for weeks on end. Some early Christian traditions mention that the voyage lasted more than 40 days. 40 days. With each day of that crossing, John knew the fate awaiting him. Roman methods of execution were known throughout the empire. Crucifixion for the most dangerous, decapitation for Roman citizens, damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, for slaves and Christians. And for special cases that demanded maximum spectacle, ritual methods such as immersion in a cauldron of boiling oil or molten lead. Examine the engineering of the execution. The Roman cauldron used in this kind of ritual was built to impressive dimensions. Estimates place it at roughly 1.5 meters in diameter by 2 meters in depth, constructed of heavy bronze, capable of holding approximately 3,000 liters of oil. The oil used was generally cheap olive oil or low-grade cooking oil, heated over a coal furnace until it approached boiling point around 300 degrees Celsius. To put that in human scale, consider that a modern domestic oven reaches a maximum of 250 degrees Celsius. An industrial deep fryer operates between 180 and 200 degrees. The Roman cauldron ran above 300. Full immersion in liquid at that temperature causes instantaneous death by thermal shock, with immediate destruction of the skin, muscles, and organs. This was the weapon chosen to kill John. Witness the day of judgment. Tertullian records that John was brought before Emperor Domitian. The emperor demanded that the apostle renounce Christ and offer sacrifice to his image. John refused. No detailed record of the words exchanged survives, but patristic sources indicate absolute firmness on the apostle's part. A 90-year-old man, bent with age, eyes weary, voice faint, saying no to the most powerful man in the known world. Domitian ordered a public execution. The site chosen, according to the tradition preserved by Jerome in the year 393, in his work against Jovinian, Book 1, Chapter 26, was near the Porta Latina, one of the gates of the Aurelian Wall to the south of Rome. It was a busy location, with constant traffic from travelers and merchants, a guaranteed crowd, an efficient spectacle. But the moment of what actually happened there still needs to be revealed. Construct the scene in your mind. Roman soldiers position the bronze cauldron over a furnace, already blazing with coals. The oil inside churns violently, releasing columns of dense steam that rise 5 meters into the air. The acrid smell of scorching oil fills the air for hundreds of meters in every direction. Onlookers press in from all sides. Merchants abandon their negotiations. Children climb onto adult shoulders for a better view. Some accounts record that thousands were present that day. John is led to the edge of the cauldron, stripped. According to the available historical sources, the apostle does not resist, does not plead, does not weep. Tertullian describes the scene with a striking phrase. He was plunged into the boiling oil as into a ritual bath. The crowd held its breath, and then the impossible happened. John emerged alive, unharmed, without visible burns, without signs of extreme heat, without the charred tissue that every execution by boiling oil produced within seconds. Tertullian uses a phrase that became iconic in early Christian tradition. The apostle came out of the cauldron more purified than injured. The records show something no one had expected. The crowd, according to preserved tradition, fell silent. Roman soldiers stepped back. The executioner assigned to carry out the sentence did not know what to do. Domitian, informed of what had occurred, faced a politically devastating dilemma. A failed public execution was imperial humiliation, but executing the man again, by a different method, would only expose further the fragility of Rome's power before an unarmed old man. The emperor chose exile. Consider the engineering of that political decision. Domitian could not simply release John. That would mean acknowledging that the God of the Christians was more powerful than the divinized emperor. He could not openly kill him because the cauldron had failed before thousands of witnesses. The solution was to remove John from circulation, sending him to an isolated place, far from trade routes, far from active Christian communities, far from the capital, Patmos. Understand what that island represented in the Roman context. Patmos is a small rocky island in the Aegean Sea, part of the Dodecanese archipelago, with approximately 34 square kilometers of total area. To put it in scale, that is roughly half the size of the island of Manhattan. Arid soil, sparse vegetation, few inhabitants, no significant agriculture, no meaningful commerce. Rome used it as a penal colony for political and religious prisoners. Follow the journey from Ephesus to Patmos. The straight-line distance between the two locations is roughly 90 kilometers, but ancient navigation, depending on the winds and the Aegean currents, could stretch that crossing into several days of travel. John was transported aboard one of the Roman vessels that regularly made the route, carrying other political exiles. Grasp what that exile meant for a man of 90. No Christian community around him, none of the brothers in faith he had discipled in Ephesus for decades. No access to scrolls of the Hebrew Scriptures, no human warmth of a spiritual family. Only rock, sun, sea, and silence. Silence. But the most important work of John's life had not yet begun. It was in that exile, in a cave on the rocky hillside of Patmos, according to the tradition preserved by Eusebius of Caesarea in his Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, Chapter 18, that John received the vision that would become the final book of the New Testament, the Apocalypse. 22 chapters, 404 verses, approximately 12,000 words in the original Greek, one of the most influential works in all of Western literature. Consider the devastating contrast. Emperor Domitian wanted to silence the apostle. Instead, he produced the exact setting in which John wrote the text that would prophesy, in symbolic language, the fall of the Roman Empire itself, and of every oppressive empire that would ever rise against God throughout history. The attempted execution became a platform for proclamation. The exile became a retreat of revelation. On the outside, total defeat. On the inside, a theological victory that would reverberate for 2,000 years. A foundational historical question then arises about how the cauldron of boiling oil failed to kill John. Patristic sources treat the event as a direct miracle of divine intervention. Tertullian, Jerome, and other early Christian writers do not seek a naturalistic explanation. For them, the God who raised Jesus from the dead preserved his final apostle for a specific purpose, to complete the canon of Scripture with the apocalyptic revelation. For secular historians, the event remains at the margins between preserved tradition and hagiographic narrative. There are no direct contemporary Roman records of the failed execution, but the consistency of early Christian sources, from Tertullian, writing approximately 105 years after the event, to Jerome and Augustine in the centuries that followed, suggests that something extraordinary was preserved in the collective memory of the early church. The exact location, the Porta Latina, became a Christian pilgrimage site from the earliest centuries. In the year 550 of the Christian era, a small chapel was constructed on the traditional site of the frustrated martyrdom. In 1509, Pope Julius II ordered the construction of a permanent chapel over the site, known in Italian as San Giovanni a Olio, St. John in oil. Beside it, the larger basilica named San Giovanni a Porta Latina preserves the tradition to this day. Both temples can be visited in Rome. Calculate the impact of John's survival in the years that followed. Domitian was assassinated in the year 96, victim of a palace conspiracy involving members of his own Praetorian Guard. His successor, Nerva, governed for only 16 months, but long enough to revoke many of the religious persecutions. Political prisoners were freed. Political exiles were permitted to return. John returned to Ephesus, follow the return of the old apostle. He was now approximately 92 or 93 years old, bent, thin, marked by his years in exile, but he carried with him the scroll of the Apocalypse, copied onto papyrus rolls during his years on Patmos. The Christian community of Ephesus received him as one receives a dead man returned from the grave, because in the eyes of the Roman world, that is exactly what he was. The final years of John in Ephesus were recorded by Irenaeus of Lyon in the work Against Heresies, Book 2, Chapter 22. Bishop Polycarp of Smyrna, who was a direct disciple of John, transmitted to his own disciples memories of the apostles' final years. According to these traditions, John lived to approximately 100 years of age, dying of natural causes around the year 100 or 101 of the Christian era. He was buried in Ephesus. John is the only one of the 12 apostles who did not die a martyr's death. Examine the significance of that singularity. 11 of the 12 apostles died violently for their faith. Crucifixion, decapitation, stoning, flaying, spear, sword. One died by stabbing in Jerusalem, another was sawn in two in Persia, another was crucified upside down, another was beaten to death with clubs. Every apostle paid with blood the cost of their witness. Only John died of old age, and yet the cauldron of boiling oil ensures that he too faced the maximum violence of imperial power. The difference is that he walked out alive, not through cowardice, not through denial, not through compromise, through what patristic sources called simply a divine purpose not yet fulfilled. Consider the narrative pattern of this story. A man of 90 years, the last of a generation, the final living guardian of direct memories of Jesus. He does not die early, he does not give up, he is not silenced. Instead, he is placed in the most isolated location in the known world to write the text that describes the end of all time. History records the paradox. The persecution that intended to erase John from memory produced the book that guaranteed his memory to the end of human history. The system worked for 16 years, and then history demonstrated something else. Observe what that survival meant to Christians of the 2nd century. The news of the failed Cauldron spread through Christian communities across the Mediterranean within months. It was cited by Tertullian in direct apologia against Roman paganism. It was used by Jerome in theological debates. It was referenced by Augustine in the construction of martyrological theology. The event in Rome became living proof, according to early Christian tradition, that the God of the Christians protected his servants when there remained a mission not yet completed. Hundreds of thousands of Christians were executed in the 3 centuries that followed, crucified, burned, devoured by beasts, decapitated, drowned. Imperial persecution reached its peak under Decius in 250, under Valerian in 257, under Diocletian in 303. Each wave of persecution produced new martyrs, new stories, new relics, but the story of John's cauldron kept being told, generation after generation, century after century. Measure the historical strangeness of that fact. Domitian ruled for 14 years. He built palaces. He conducted military campaigns in Britannia and Dacia. He reformed the Roman economy. He sponsored spectacular games. He reformed the imperial religion. He is documented on coins, inscriptions, statues, and extensive historiographical accounts by Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus. And yet, what most people remember about the reign of Domitian today, 2,000 years later, is primarily one specific detail: that he tried to kill a Christian apostle in a cauldron of boiling oil and failed. The emperor was forgotten. The apostle remained. Examine the direct legacy of the work John produced in those final years. 5 books of the New Testament are traditionally attributed to him. The Gospel according to John, with 21 chapters and 879 verses. The first letter of John, with 5 chapters. The second letter of John, with only 13 verses. The third letter of John, with only 15 verses. And the Apocalypse, with 22 chapters. Approximately 240 pages in a standard modern Bible. 5 books among the 27 of the New Testament, nearly 20% of the total, all of it produced or compiled by the same aged hand that entered a cauldron of boiling oil and walked out alive. Early Christian tradition called John the beloved disciple, not from sentimentality, from recognition of function. But the story does not end only in Rome and Patmos. Follow what happened to the physical sites. The Porta Latina in Rome still exists. It was part of the Aurelian Walls, constructed by Emperor Aurelian between the years 270 and 275. The small church known as San Giovanni a Olio still stands, restored numerous times across the centuries, with the most notable renovation carried out by architect Francesco Borromini in 1658. The chapel has an octagonal floor plan, approximately 5 meters in diameter, with an unbroken tradition of Christian pilgrimage since the 6th century. Patmos, in turn, became one of the most important Christian sites in the Mediterranean. In the year 1088, the Byzantine monk Christodoulos founded the monastery of St. John the Theologian on the island. Constructed as a monastic fortress in limestone, with walls up to 15 meters high, the cave where, according to tradition, John received the visions of the Apocalypse was transformed into a chapel. Today, 2,000 years after the events, the island receives hundreds of thousands of visitors per year. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization declared the site a World Heritage Site in 1999. Calculate the mathematical improbability of that preservation. Rome fell. The Western Roman Empire collapsed in the year 476. Hundreds of civilizations rose and disappeared. Entire libraries were destroyed. Entire oral traditions were erased. And yet, the detailed memory of a 90-year-old Christian man surviving a cauldron of boiling oil, crossed 2,000 years of history, was preserved in manuscripts, copied in monasteries, cited in sermons, and commemorated in annual celebrations of the Christian Church. The 6th day of May, in some Christian calendars, marks the commemoration known as St. John before the Latin Gate, a liturgical feast celebrating specifically the frustrated martyrdom of the apostle. The observance entered the Roman liturgical calendar in the 5th century, was maintained for more than 1,500 years, was removed from the universal calendar in 1969, but continues to be celebrated in specific Christian communities to this day. Think about the human detail this story reveals. John was 90 years old. He was at the biological end. He no longer had the strength to resist physically. He no longer had the voice to deliver great speeches. He no longer had the vigor of youth. And yet it was at that moment of maximum fragility that he completed the most consequential part of his mission. The Apocalypse was not written by a young fisherman from Galilee. It was written by an old man exiled on a rocky island after surviving a public execution. The strength was not in his body. It was somewhere else. And that is the part of the story that has continued to resonate 2,000 years later. John died around the year 100 in Ephesus, according to the tradition preserved by Eusebius and Irenaeus. He was buried near the city, where he had led the Christian community for decades. In the 4th century, a basilica was constructed over the traditional site of his tomb. Archaeological remains of that basilica, known as the Basilica of St. John in Ephesus, can still be visited in present-day Turkey. The ruins reveal a structure approximately 130 meters in length by 65 meters in width, with 6 domes, financed by Emperor Justinian around the year 548. The cauldron of boiling oil was not the end of John's story. It was the beginning of the most important part. And here is the paradox that traverses 2,000 years. Emperor Domitian had at his disposal the entire power of the known world, legions, cauldrons, arenas, exiles, torture, swords, and yet he could not erase the memory of a single old man who refused to offer incense to his image. The method of execution chosen to humiliate and silence the apostle became, within hours, an instrument for the eternal elevation of his cause. The visible failure of the cauldron was the mechanism of something more enduring than any empire ever built. The story of John surviving the boiling oil crosses the boundary between historical testimony and narrative of faith. For some, it is proof of direct divine intervention. For others, it is a preserved tradition that reflects the deep memory of the early church about its final apostle. For all, regardless of interpretation, it is one of the most remarkable stories of human resistance documented from antiquity. A 90-year-old man, a bronze cauldron, 300 degrees Celsius of oil, and a refusal that changed the calendar of the world. The boiling oil failed, the exile failed, the forgetting failed. And 2,000 years later, in an octagonal chapel near the Porta Latina, in a cave on the rocky slopes of Patmos, in the ruins of a basilica in Ephesus, the story continues to be told, not as myth, not as legend, as a preserved record of early Christian tradition, sustained by Tertullian, Jerome, Eusebius, Irenaeus, and the fathers of the ancient church. The emperor who ordered the execution died murdered by his own guard. The apostle who entered the cauldron died surrounded by disciples in Ephesus after writing the final book of the New Testament. The difference between those two deaths is the difference between power that coerces and power that endures.